Hey everybody, welcome to ADD Masterminds. I'm Livwat, and today I'm here with Jeff Dornik.
Hey there, glad to be back. This is my second time on this one, right? Second or third, something like that?
I think it's second time. Yeah. I have so many co-hosts. Because you're technically a co-host. We don't really do guests. It's more like co-hosts. So
nice. I'm gonna add that to my resume.
Co-host of ADD Masterminds. That's
exactly.
Yeah. So how's COVID life, Jeff?
Heading back into shelter in place after we were open for I think a solid 3 weeks maybe, and then now we're heading back to restaurants are shut down, bars are closed down. Pretty much it's back to hiding in our homes, and the beaches are shut down. So yeah, I mean
that's
everything's
crazy.
closed.
Like California without beaches, hey? Like that's 90% of what you folks do, right? Like
exactly. And the hard part too is it's right there. It's like driving distance for everybody in California, and then it's like that temptation of, do we go there anyway?
Yeah. So how are you adjusting to go back into shelter in place? Like I think you did that for quite a while, and are you currently working, or are you still just doing kind of podcasting?
We're working from home, doing all the podcasting, launching a new network, organization, all that kind of stuff. So yeah. So I mean, luckily I've been working from home this entire time. So that's it's not like we went to work and then all of a sudden it was like we're gonna close down after a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and like for me, I've worked from home quite a bit. We're continuing to kind of move into the reopening. Like it's I think we're phase 2 right now. And so churches are open, but no singing allowed, only humming. And I mean, there's all these things about like distancing and all this stuff. And I'm just like, it just seems like such a bother, and it's still going to be weird. So I'm good with like just doing the streaming service right now. I do have to travel for work sometimes. And so I've got some work trips that I'm doing and stuff like that. And so we got to wear masks while we're out there in these oil field sites and stuff. And it's like, I mean, my job is to make sure everybody's doing those things. So it's like, it's funny when people want to argue with me about it. I'm like, well, it's kind of part of my job to enforce that anyways. So like,
yeah. Well, and that's one of the funny things too that I find about a lot of people that are, anti-mask, and again, there's always the conversations about whether the masks are beneficial, can cause more harm or whatever it is. I feel like there's a logical conversation to have about that. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of people that they're like, I'm not going to wear masks if somebody's telling me to do it. It's like, for me, I'm looking at it like, okay, so if you're going into somebody else's home, you're going into somebody else's business. That's one of those things where, okay, we respect the business. If you want to protest because the authorities are telling you, wear a mask and you want to be rebellious, do that in public, but then respect the private business owner.
Yeah. And, authority is such an interesting thing, right? Because it's just like, I get it. Like when, authorities make laws that cause us to break with, what God's telling us to do, then clearly, I mean, that's, okay, I'm going to go against authority. But when it's something that is just more personal preference, it's like, well, how do I be a good Christian in this scenario? Right. And so anyways, so Aunt Jemima, like they've decided they're canceling Aunt Jemima. And I know a lot of people have different opinions about that, but, I've seen so many articles circulating about Nancy Green and saying like Nancy Green's family is very upset. They're erasing Aunt Jemima. And I'm like, solution, rename it Nancy Green Syrup. She keeps her place in history, and now we don't have whatever stereotypes were associated with Aunt Jemima.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, I mean, that was kind of like her character for lack of a better word that she played. Yeah. And, she was the face of that for the longest time. And, at a certain point, like I get the family being like, hey, come on, like this is our heritage. This is our background, and you're taking away from us.
Yeah, I know. And I could see, but I'm like, I think that would be a better compromise than just like either not having the syrup anymore. I don't know what the plan is. I haven't even heard what the plan is, but I'm like, I think that's a better solution anyways.
Yeah.
Other than just
and I think Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's hard too, because then you start getting into, Disneyland and Disney World are getting rid of Splash Mountain, because that's based off of Song of the South. And
I don't know if they're even getting, like, if they're getting rid of it. They're rebranding it under Princess and the Frog, right?
right,
Yeah, yeah.
right. So, but they're taking down the old theme
Yeah,
and then
yeah, yeah.
replacing it with the new one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you start getting into, essentially you are, it's one of those things with that. I understand, because they always like re-up or update the rides and like all that
Right.
kind of stuff. But at the same time, you start getting into, to a certain degree, rewriting history. Are you just caving into the mobs? Like, is it all PR? It starts getting crazy.
But everything is PR.
Literally
It
everything is
literally
PR.
is. Yeah. And I mean, like, it's funny because you're just like, are you doing this because you really care? And it's like, well, I'm doing this because I need the money, or I want to make the money. Right. And it's kind of funny because I have, I know people who are like very environmentally conscious, and you have like a business owner that's like, okay, well, I'm going to put a timer on the lights whenever you go into a room, and, only runs for like 15 minutes or whatever. And then the light goes off. Right. And it's like, so I kind of look at that. I'm like, okay, are you doing this because you care about the environment, or are you doing this because you are, what's the word? I don't want to say cheap, but
I was gonna say cheap.
smart with your money, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, and it's funny. I think part of it, like when we talk about environmentalism too, I think kind of the funny thing is like when my parents, when I was a kid, they would be like, well, I think we should use reusable diapers. Why? Because it's cheaper. And nowadays, you got like young parents that are like, well, we're going to use reusable diapers because it's better for the environment. And it's funny how these things that are seen as like virtues used to be more so just, I want to save money. And so it's kind of interesting to see how like what, a lot of the world sees as virtues are actually just ways too of getting more money, right?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things too about a lot of people that, like I interact with it, or, obviously like against, like they disagree with the premise of global warming being
Yeah.
man-made and all this kind
Yeah.
of stuff. And, and so I feel like oftentimes what happens is with those kinds of crowds, they go so anti-organic,
Mm-hmm.
they go,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all for all the reusable stuff. It's like they're taking a side and they're just going to go hardcore for that. And for me, I'm looking at it like, I'd kind of like to be healthier. So I'm
Yes.
going to get the plastics out of my life. I'm going to eat organic. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
take these certain precautions. My motivation isn't necessarily to save the earth from ultimate, destruction of fire because of global
Yeah.
warming. I'm looking at
Yeah.
it like, I'd like to be healthier and not have to deal with the health ramifications of it. So there's different
Yeah.
motivations, I guess.
Well, I think that's part of it too, is like, it's like, and that, I think that's my issue a lot of times with when people get to their ideological corners, which is basically one of the themes of my new album, which is being released July 14th. I'm announcing it here. I think
Nice.
I might have announced it on the Wax Museum too, but this will be the first time I've announced it here. And it's titled Uncaged. And the whole premise is being uncaged ideologically, spiritually, and artistically. And basically, it's just kind of like this idea that we're all in cages. We're in ideological cages where it's like anything outside of this doesn't really exist or doesn't really count. Spiritually, it's the same thing. You can kind of get into your like theological cage. And then when someone says, God told me this, and you're like, well, nope, that doesn't fit with my theology. And it's like, well, maybe we need to evaluate things a little bit outside of your cage. And same thing artistically. I think it's really obvious artistically because like somebody comes out with something like Kevin Max has a new album. I don't know if you've heard it, but it is like awesome. I've only listened to the first couple tracks, but I'm like, it's all like just trippy,
Yeah,
weird
well,
electronic stuff.
that's the really cool thing about Kevin Max is that
Yeah.
he's one of those guys that he's like, I'm going to be creative. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
sound like anybody else, and he also has that voice that doesn't sound like anybody else.
Oh my gosh.
And
Yes.
it's his vibrato that he pulls off, and his songs are just like insane. You're like, okay, that's a
Yeah.
Kevin Max song.
Yes. And so, so I look at someone like him and I'm like, I think there's people on the mainstream that are like, yeah, no, this is too weird. It's not music. It doesn't fit in my cage. Right. And so that's kind of the premise. And so when I think about like people who are like, well, I'm not going to eat organic because that's what someone who like believes the world's going to end is going to do. Right. And it's like, for that reason, they're going to stay in their cage and not even consider. And for you, it's like you're kind of breaking outside of a cage that maybe your friends are in by saying, well, I'm buying organic for a different purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's one of those things where it's like, not everybody's going to agree on every minute detail, but at the same time, we have to take a look at every single circumstance and every single thing that comes at us. And we are going to have to reevaluate that on the merits of that specific situation. And so it's like, for me, I have questions about whether, global warming is caused by humans. It's like, okay, that's a debate that we can have. It's a conversation that we can have, but I don't think anybody can argue that cancer's on the rise, diabetes on the rise, all these health issues are on the rise, but then also what else is on the rise? Pesticides, chemicals, GMOs, like all this kind of stuff. And you're like, maybe there's a correlation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, like if it's possible, and I honestly think whatever this is, whatever we're doing right now, because I guarantee we're putting toxins in the air, like whatever effect it's having on the climate. I mean, we don't need to debate that. I'm not a climatologist. I don't, whatever. But I know, because I work in the oil and gas industry, that there is stuff we're releasing to the air that's not good for us.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if we could do less of that, it'd be better. And so I do think that eventually we're going to innovate our way out of this. And so it's just a matter of time before we innovate it. So people that are trying to push that timeline and say, we got 5 years to fix this, I'm like, yeah, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I do think that like there is innovation is going to get us out of this. So I was thinking, okay, so a lot of times Christians like to harp on like sin sometimes, but only specific sins. And I was thinking about how like there are sins that we all identify with. I think, well, here's my quote. Actually, I was talking to Theo offline. And this is what I said to him, and it struck me as something that I thought was worth discussing. I said, I think at some level we all find our identity in our sin. Sanctification is a process of peeling back the layers of false identity and getting closer to our true God-given identity. And it's just funny how like there's specific sins that are addressed so publicly and so politically, and we're like, well, those people identify with their sin, and it's like, yeah, no, we all do. Like, it's a human condition. We all identify with our sin at some level. It's kind of like, well, I'm an opinionated person, and you're just a jerk to everybody. And it's like, but it's who I am. I'm the guy that speaks his mind. And it's like, no, that's sin. Like, you're not using gentleness. I don't see the fruits of the Spirit. But it's like, but the fruits of the Spirit aren't part of my personality, right? And it just got me thinking, like the true fruit of a believer is being willing to work on those things and to allow, the Holy Spirit to overtake you. And there should be a shift, right?
Yeah. Well, and also too, that's the whole point of when you start getting into doctrine and theology, of you begin to separate out justification from sanctification. I think that everybody focuses so much on the justification. They're like, I became a Christian, I'm saved, that's it. And it's like, well, there's this whole rest of your life. That's the sanctification part, which is where the Holy Spirit is making you more Christ-like, literally for the rest of your life. If you're not going through that, maybe we got to go back. We got to deal with this whole justification thing and kind of start over a little bit. And that's kind of one of those. That's kind of one of those things. And I think to a certain degree, everybody oftentimes they get comfortable with where they are, and they don't actually want to put in the hard work of growing and bettering themselves and getting out of their comfort zone. And then it's easier to try to make excuses than it is to say, you know what, I need to knock this off and I need to get better. Because it's like nobody wants to admit that they're wrong. I think that's one of the hardest things for people to do today, is admit that they're wrong.
That's nuts though. Like, like it's like, if you can't admit you're wrong, how do you grow as a human being? Like, life is a series of steps in changing as a human being. And it's like, and it's weird to me that people just get stuck at a certain point and decide, yeah, okay, I'm done growing. And I'm like, you're not you're not alive anymore. Like, it's like, that's a cage you need to bust. And I'm like, it blows my mind that people live like that. And I think it's the same thing again, like, you know, even those people who, like, you know, when we get back to the whole artistic thing, it's kind of like, well, I don't see that as art. And it's like, man, you're missing out on so much stuff. And it can be the same thing spiritually. It can be the same thing ideologically. Like, I don't know, like, my artist brain is just kind of overtaking everything, where I'm just like, man, I could gather a little bit of this, and I'm going to make something new. Right. And I'm doing that in everything. And, you know, it was funny because we did an episode of Wax Museum. I did it with Phil Hurd, because he talked to me about, like, Richard Rohr, the fact that we did like a two episode series on Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ. And Phil's like, you know, that, you know, Richard Rohr is a false teacher. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that. Because I'm like, to me, it's like, I will gather truth from wherever I see it. And it could be somebody who's dubbed as a false teacher. And like, my favorite thing I always say about Richard Rohr is that he says, it's not that the mysteries of God are unknowable, it's that they're infinitely knowable. And it's like, that's what we're falling into, is just like this infinite mystery. And I feel like within, like, the more progressive realm of Christianity, they'll see that the more fundamentalist form of Christianity has a tendency to just kind of close the loop on things. And I'm like, I think that's something we can learn from progressives. It's like, no, I don't know everything. I'm still learning. And it's that humility of still learning. And that's far more attractive than you going up to someone who's a non-believer and saying, like, hey, I know everything, listen to me.
Yeah. Well, you know, what was interesting too was that I recently read the book. It's actually called "Don't Burn This Book" by Dave Rubin, and it's a really good book. It touches a little bit on politics, but it's mostly like ideology and kind of it's this idea of free thinking, think for yourself, and that sort of thing. And so I wrote a review of that and posted it on my website, Gatekeepers Online. And then, you know, I shared it in a few different places, and it was funny because there was a bunch of people that posted comments, just random people, but they're like, you know, he's gay, right? And I'm like, yeah. And but it's like, but at the same time, it's like, what he's saying is true.
Yeah.
And, you know, you may disagree with homosexuality, you may disagree with that aspect, but that doesn't mean that you can't agree with the guy when it comes to free thinking and having open and honest discussions and constantly reevaluating and not apologizing to the mob and like all that kind of stuff. It's like, we can agree with that. We can find the point of disagreement. Let's discuss it. But at the same time, that one point of disagreement doesn't invalidate the truthfulness of everything else that he's saying.
And it's so hard because that's you know, that's the thing a lot of people identify with, right? My sexuality. I mean, it's the same thing with gender too. And it's like, to me, it's like, man, like, we all identify with all kinds of things. So let's let the Holy Spirit work in us. And I'm like, the amount of rejection those individuals have experienced is appalling. Like, it's like, how do you, like, as the church, you know, you've decided to reject these people, and you're saying it's on a biblical basis and all this stuff. And I understand all the biblical basis and everything, but I'm like, that rejection's still there. And there's a whole missions field of these people who they're not allowed, right? They're not allowed in. And I saw this post, actually, it's a Facebook group. I think it's called the Heretic Happy Hour, the After Hours group. And they had this picture of this man who was at a gay pride parade, and he was offering free hugs from a dad to all these people that were in the pride parade. And I'm like, man, like, more than anything, like, when I look at that group of individuals, I'm like, that's what they need. They need a dad's hug. And I'm like, that's so powerful. Like, regardless of, like, you know, whether people believe this is a sin or not, it's like, man, there's no denying there's a lot of hurt people that have been rejected by their family. And I'm like, what a beautiful thing. And I'm like, part of me is like, next pride parade, I'm giving free hugs.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. And that's one of my biggest frustrations within Christianity. And again, I tend to be a little bit of a rebel and go against the grain a little bit. Gets me in trouble sometimes, but it's always fun. But I feel like when you're dealing with something like homosexuality, like from my perspective, I'm looking at it like, okay, Bible clearly teaches it's a sin. And it's something that I think we need to be careful not to become accepting of as if it's not a sin. With that said, that doesn't mean that we view gay people or anybody in the homosexual community as the enemy. They're our mission field. And I think that that's the difference. Is oftentimes it's really easy for Christians to see people that are behaving in ways that we don't like, and we see them as the enemy, as opposed to these are the people that we need to reach out to. These are the people that we need to love. And I think that that's vitally important. And I think it's easier for people, like we were kind of saying before, it's easier for people to be set in their ways, have their own little bubble, be in their own little cage, and then they kick everybody else out, as opposed to going out into the world where it's messy, it's crazy, people are sinful. It's like, you go out there and you're supposed to love people. What did Jesus do? He hung out with the prostitutes and tax collectors, not the most clean cut crowd. It's like, why don't we take the same approach when it comes to the gay community, or with, essentially any anti-Christian community,
Exactly. Well, and I think, it's the same thing with the people who oppose you ideologically, like the people of the opposing, point of view politically, or, and it's like, we've got so many ways of separating us and them, when in reality, it's like, we're all God's children. So how do we show the love of the Father to individuals? Because when it comes down to it, it's like, this is about love. And when Christians look like they're opposing to love, we've got a problem. Because it's like, and I get why Christians are opposing this type of love, but it's like, we've got to have a better way of approaching this. Yeah. And I mean, and it's the same thing too, when we see people who are trying to help out the marginalized, and Christians are like, hold on, that doesn't fit with our politics. I'm like, okay, well, now you appear to be opposing love again. And it's like, and we do a lot of that. And it's like, there's got to be a better way to be like, no. This is what I believe. I believe that these people are being exploited. And so we want to step in and show you a better way of handling this issue. And I think that's actually what it all boils down to, honestly. All of our arguments, all of our, failures to show the world love has been us saying, no, we think there's a better way, but instead it comes off as, I hate you. And it's like, we got to do better. Okay. So I was thinking about, I wrote down originality on the ADD master list. I'm not even sure where I was going to go with that, but what does originality mean to you?
I would say, not for me, it comes down to not being afraid to forge your own path and figure out your own way of going about and doing things. And I think it's really easy for people to get into a rut and just kind of follow what everybody else does. But when you look at the history of business people, or the great politicians, or the great theologians, or whatever that might be, oftentimes what they do is they forge their own path. They come up with a new concept, a new idea that nobody has ever thought of, or very few people had thought of, and then they make it their own. Like for example, there's somebody like you look at somebody like Elon Musk, right? That guy's totally original. Every single thing that he comes up with. I remember listening to his podcast the last time he was on Joe Rogan, and he's talking about transplanting devices into your brain that will fix things through electromagnetic fields. And I'm just like, how do you come up with that kind of stuff?
Oh, it's great. And I mean, like in the medical field, like to correct problems is good, but then it gets terrifying when they're like, now we're going to enhance and make superhumans. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then it's like, now we can read each other's brains. And I'm like, actually, I bought a book. So I did a series on the Wax Museum on Sapiens. And Yuval something, Usted Harari. Anyways, he wrote that book Sapiens, but he made a second book that's called Deuce. I think it's Homo Deuce. Something like that. It's a weird title, but it's like, careful now. The idea is to look at, instead of a historical perspective, make predictions for the future, which includes the modifications we're going to make to the human body. And I'm like, that sounds terrifying, but I'm kind of intrigued to read it. So that's going to be my next big read, is to talk about like kind of that human advancement. But I do think, like, to find originality, you do need a wide palette, right? It's like, you cannot, if you remain caged, all you're going to do is bring the same things, right? And it's like, you got to get outside the cage and start drawing influences from a whole bunch of different areas. And, like, I think Christians especially, when we talk about Christianity, we're scared to do that. And, it's like, well, it's not biblical to do that. And I like, I love that passage where the Apostle Paul, walks into this group, and I can't remember which group of people it was, but he said, like, that unknown God, I found him.
Yeah.
And it's like, that implies to me that, Paul, the Apostle Paul, was an uncaged thinker. He actually studied their culture and understood their religion, and he's able to speak from that standpoint to those people where he could actually speak their language. And I'm like, that's such a beautiful thing. And so I think originality does require a wide palette so that you can come out of nowhere with something that's like, what?
Well, that's where the Bible talks about being all things to all men, to be
Yes, I
able to
love
reach
that.
them. And I think right now what we've seen within mainstream evangelicalism is this idea that that evangelism is inviting your friends to church, and the people that you invite to church are the people that look like us, and
Yeah.
they already act Christian even if they're not really Christian, right? So they're clean cut, they dress modestly, they they don't have too many tattoos or piercings or something
Yeah.
along those lines. But then when you actually look at, okay, how did Jesus act? How did the apostles act? How did Paul act? They went to, like, for lack of a better term, enemy territory. Like, Jesus went and hung out with the people that the religious elite saw as the utmost sinners, the worst of the
Yeah,
worst. That's who he went and hung
absolutely.
out with. Where is that today in Christianity? I mean, you don't see that. You don't see Christian pastors or Christian leaders or anybody like that going into the gay district of San Francisco. You don't see
Yeah.
them going into West Hollywood. You don't see them even going into the inner cities. You see them staying comfortable in their big mega churches. And it's
Yeah.
like, maybe we need to get out of our comfort zone a little bit. Stop just talking to other theologians, and let's go where the people are. Like, that's what Jesus did.
And I mean, I think that's where, again, we're seeing that different incentive, right? Because I've been thinking a lot about platform, and how when you get a platform, it's very easy for you to flip into becoming a narcissist. And, it's like, what person who's gotten political power, what person in that position has not become a narcissist? And I'd say the same thing with pastors. I think it's very easy for a pastor, and it can be a very small church even, where you become a narcissist. And it's like, you give anybody a little bit of power, and it's so quick that everything can become about them. And so once you get a platform, once you get a full-time job in ministry even, your incentive is to keep your job. Your incentive is to pay your mortgage. And it's like, and so as we get bigger, it gets even more difficult. And when you get to the level of mega church, it's like, and I mean, you see the same thing in politics too, right? Like, where it's like, well, I'm the school trustee, and then it's like, you move up to being the mayor, you move up to being, provincial or state representative. And it's like, as you get up the scale, it's like the cost of being, true to your calling or true to your whatever it is, becomes higher. And it's crazy to me that, like, we're seeing the very same things. We see it in business too. It's like, and like we said with Splash Mountain, it's like, well, there's incentive, just a financial incentive. So it's hard to even tell what the morality, is that's backing that decision. And we're seeing that in churches. And it's like, well, we want everybody to be comfortable. I remember talking to a pastor about that. And it's like, we're going to redesign, the platform. We're going to redesign all of this because we want it to be pleasant for an artistic person to come into this sanctuary. We want them to be comfortable. And it's like, okay, yeah. I mean, like, that's cool. But at what point are we putting so much resources into that we kind of lose our souls, right? Like, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? And I think it's possible to do both, but I don't know, like, the more and more I see this glitz, and I see this beautiful, well-oiled machine that is the church, the more skeptical I become of it. And I believe we have younger generations that are becoming more and more skeptical of that. And they just want the basics. Like they just want Jesus.
Yeah. Well, and see, like that's my thing. And this is one of the things that I say, and it gets me in trouble. But I'm just like, at a certain point, just tear it all down and let's start over, because it's gotten way out of hand. So the thing you really have to understand too about churches is that when you start getting into individual people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's got a different personality type. Some people are more analytical. Those people that are oftentimes analytical, they don't care as much about all the fancy stuff or artistry or whatever it is. And then you have the artists, and oftentimes they don't care about the analytical side of things. And then there's combinations of the two and all that kind of stuff. I think oftentimes what you see is that there will be a pastor of a church, and they make the church about that pastor. So then whatever personality type that pastor is, that's who he attracts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think oftentimes you see the creatives and the people that are more emotional or coming up with really cool ideas. They're going for the experience more on, let's say, the charismatic side or more in the mainstream. And then you'll see the people that are more analytical will go more towards the theological, Bible study, expositional preaching, and all that kind of stuff. And I think what oftentimes happens is then both sides will point at the other side and say, you're wrong and you're wrong. It's like, well, maybe you're both wrong because you guys are each missing out on the little bit that the other side has that they're doing right. If we could get a mix where we're focused less on the personality and more just on the Christian walk, fellowship, worship, Bible teaching, that covers all the bases, not just one. I think we could do a lot better and stop focusing so much on the frivolous things, I think.
That reminds me of like that church you have where it's like worship, Thanksgiving, and fellowship, which spells WTF. I won't explain that one, kids.
Hey, so wait, are you saying that you're going to start a church called WTF?
Oh, that's a great idea. I like it. Yeah, that's good marketing right there, because it's all about marketing, right? I picked up.
Exactly.
I don't know. You know, it's funny though, because like, you know, for you and I, we can look at the church and say, well, it shouldn't be about personality. It shouldn't be, you know, but you and I are both building brands too, you know, at the same time, you know, our brands. And it's like, this is the way I want things to be, you know, like, it's like, I've got the Bridges of Watt album and then the 2 podcasts where it's just like, I'm just building bridges, but that's what I do. And it's like, at what point, you know, do you start buying into, like, I guess, distracted by your own reflection? Like, that's so important, because we watch people do that all the time, and we critique that all the time, where people are getting distracted by their own reflection. How do you keep from being distracted by your own reflection, Jeff?
I think a lot of it is being very intentional, and it's not about, like, for example, like my website, Gatekeepers Online, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I intentionally did not set that up as a ministry or organization of Jeff Dornik.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think a lot of people, they make their organization, you know, about their specific teaching. For me, I was looking at it like, okay, how can we collaborate with people? You know, how can we make it less about me? For me, I would love it if I could get to the point to where I'm not essential at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can just show up and maybe I can give a little direction. I'm kind of keeping the technical side of things going. But you know, everybody's doing their own podcast, they're doing their own writing. And I'm like,
kind of disappear.
It's not about me. Like, I feel like it's this weird thing. It's almost like you've arrived when you're no longer needed. It's like that's kind of my mentality with all of this. And so for me, it's like when I'm looking at, like we've gotten into publishing, right? And we actually just announced that we're publishing a new book called Church and State. We're putting that out, pre-orders today. All right. But for me, I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, okay, how can we collaborate? How can I bring in these other people that are experts and bring them in? So like, I'm like, with this book, we've got like 13 different authors, and each one is taking a single chapter. And that way it's even though I'm the one organizing it, it's not about me. I'm just one of the 13 guys there that's writing a chapter. And it's like, this to me is the way we should be doing things, as opposed to every single book is by me, for me, about me, and it's all about my profit. And I'm like, no, let's collaborate a little bit. You know, that's just my mentality, I think.
Well, and that for me was why the shift in the name, right? It's like John Howie and Bridges of Watt are 2 different people. Bridges of Watt is that person online. And like every Sunday, Bridges of Watt ceases to exist. And it's like, and it's so nice. Like, it's just like, oh, I'm just John Howie now, right? And I mean, at work, I'm just John Howie. But it's like, and I mean, like, it's, I guess, yeah, in a way, it's kind of like an act.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's
it's like
fun to do.
it's like even for me, I will you know, because I write music, I play and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff, and I'm like, okay, so if I ever go down that route, I'm like, I don't want to put out an album with Jeff Dornik on it. It's like
Yeah.
I want to come up with like a band name.
Yeah.
That way, because I feel like when you have like, let's say, a band name, that becomes the unifying factor. I don't
Hmm.
want myself to
Hmm.
be the unifying factor. I want the unifying factor to be the music and the message and the organic feeling that you have of community and all that kind of stuff. It's not about me. It's about what the music is actually producing and the results of that. And I feel like, you know, when you start going down the route of, you know, Jeff Dornik music, it's like, I mean, who wants to unify around this crazy Norwegian?
Yeah, and I mean, the Bridge of Watt music is definitely a collaboration. Um, so like basically Zandy, my son, 16-year-old son, he created all the tracks except for one. One was actually mine. But and then I created, you know, I wrote the lyrics, I wrote the melodies, did all the vocals, and that's what we created, right? And it makes for a very interesting project because I'm just like, this is amazing. And it's like more so because it was a collaboration and I don't feel like it's self-promotion for
Mm-hmm.
me to say it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a nice feeling that way.
Yeah. So when are we coming out with the Bridge meets Jeff collaboration song?
That would be awesome. We'll have to do that.
Yeah. We can work something out.
Yeah, send me some music. See what
Yeah.
we can work with. All right. Hey, so it's funny you said analytical because that was actually on my list too.
That works.
The analytical brain. And I was thinking about, I like to think about how everything, you know, can be a superpower, but it can also be a disability. And actually, I had somebody say to me, like, you know, like at work, they're like, wow, you're very analytical. And I'm like, yeah, to a fault. Because you could just spend so much time analyzing things. You probably have the same issue sometimes, right?
Yeah, I tend to be pretty analytical and mathematical and all that kind of stuff.
Mm,
It's one of those things where I wish I wasn't so much, and it's
yeah.
definitely something that I've like worked on of getting out of that mindset, because I feel like to a certain degree, if you're too analytical, oftentimes you get like you were saying before, you get yourself into a box and then you can't get out. You
Yeah.
really limit yourself. And
Yeah.
one of my biggest things that I've really worked on over the years is stop self-limiting myself,
Mm,
because I think I used to for the longest
yeah.
time, and to where it made life extremely difficult. Whereas now I'm just kind of like, oh yeah, we'll do a book, sure, let's go for it. We want to do, you know, like
Yeah.
public speaking, sure, let's go do it. You know, like
Yeah.
that's just kind of become my mentality. But it's been
Mm,
an intentional focus on getting rid of that that ceiling that I think was kind of limiting, which is really easy for somebody who's analytical to do.
interesting. Well, and what I always find too is like I'm still stuck on this notion because I hear so many people saying like, well, this group of people think with their emotions, and this group of people they're analytical, and I'm like, and I love this from this book I read. Trying to remember what book it was. Might have been one of Mike Manson's books, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Something. It may have been from his book, but anyways, there's not really much of show notes for this, so we'll just never know. Um, but in this book, this guy was talking about this individual who had like the front part of his brain removed, which is basically the emotional center of your brain. And so it's like, wow, that's cool. Because I think all of us have thought about it. What would it be like if I was just completely rational with no emotions? And this guy returned to his job, and the first day back on the job, he was supposed to meet with some clients, but instead he spent all day looking for a new stapler. And it was like, well, let's do his cognitive testing. They do his cognitive testing and they're like, no, everything's good. Everything's good. He's fine. It's like, huh. And it took them a while to realize, because he ended up like divorced. He ended up not being able to do his job anymore and all this stuff. And what they realized is you need the emotional part of your brain in order to prioritize. And so it's like, wow. So basically, we're using the emotional part of our brain to prioritize. Therefore, we can never turn this off. We can never turn off the emotional part of our brain. And so I think when we argue with people, we got to consider that we've got emotions too. And it's ridiculous first to point to someone else and say, no, you're being emotional. It's like, we're all being emotional. I mean,
Yeah.
why are you getting so angry that that person's all whiny about stuff? You're angry. That's an emotion, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think with, when it comes to a lot of issues, a lot of times I think the people that are more analytical and or
Mm-hmm.
even conservative in ideology, oftentimes it's like they want to reject any kind of emotional argument. And I'm over here and I'm like, okay, so we've got the analytical side, we've got the facts, we've got the numbers and all that kind of stuff. But then how do you convey it to where people actually understand and people are motivated to actually do something? It's
Gotta
through
speak to the heart, man.
yeah, it's through the emotion. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a danger in going too analytical and there's a danger in going too emotional, but there's somewhere in the middle where you've got a little bit of both. That's really where the sweet spot is, and actually changing minds and that sort of thing. I think that's what's really missing. I mean, look at like, I was gonna say our country, but I'm in a totally different country than you. But like here in America, we're extremely polarized, whether it's
Yes.
politics,
Yeah.
theology, culturally, whatever it might be. And I think it's like, okay, so let's take the extremes away. There's something in the middle where we can debate, we can discuss,
We all
we can
want the
find
same
agreement.
things, man. Like, we all want the same things. We just disagree on how going about it.
But
And
but even then, the problem is that the majority of people agree on the majority of things. The problem is that we only focus on what we disagree on, right?
absolutely.
So it's like when it comes to abortion, it's one of those things that I always go to. It's an easy thing to point out. 90% of people in America believe that, you know, last trimester abortion, wrong. Almost
Yeah.
100% of people believe that post-birth abortion, if you can even call it abortion, is wrong. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, so why don't we just ban that first? Let's take that first, the thing that we all agree on. Let's do it. But the problem is that we
Can't give you an
can't.
inch, man.
Exactly. We can't do that because we disagree on conception. It's like, okay, so let's
Exactly.
start with a third
Exactly.
trimester and then let's debate the second.
Oh,
Like
it's
that would be the
nuts.
logical way of doing things.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it too, and I added with this issue, I always like, okay, so how are we ending up with unwanted pregnancies to begin with? I'd rather go there than wait until you've got like a botched abortion and the kid's all mangled. Like, to get graphic, I mean, that's what we're looking at. It's like, well, should we put that baby out of its misery? And I'm like, this is so messed up. Like, can we just back up and say, how did we get to this point? And I mean, and it's the same thing too when we talk about like you end up with like a political situation where you've got the worst candidates ever. I'm just hypothetical in some fantasy land where this happens. And it's like, instead of us like saying, well, do you want cyanide or do you want, I don't know, whatever poison, another poison, right? It's like, well, can we just back up? Like, how did we get to this point to begin with? And it's like, we, as human beings, we kind of get in the situation. It's kind of like you have a kid that's like completely out of control and he's like, you know, he's got a chainsaw and he's like sawing into the wall and you're like, you know, and you're just like, well, what do we do now? And it's like, if there's any ability to back up and say, how did we get to this insanity? You know, like, can we figure out how to like change or mitigate issues um earlier, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, but we always have those conversations once we already got the kid with the chainsaw sawing into the wall, right? And at
Yeah.
that point, yeah, we got to figure out how to stop that kid from destroying our house. And that's, I think that's kind of where our nations get to sometimes. Is some in, you know, it's, and so I mean at that point, yeah, maybe talking about the origin of how we got the chainsaw and the husband and wife arguing over like, well, why did you let him have a chainsaw? You know, it's like, well, no, let's stop the chainsaw, let's shut off the chainsaw somehow. And so when I think about these kinds of issues, it's bizarre to me that we want to just debate that one. And I get what you're saying. Like there needs to be some compromise, but I also think that if we go earlier and earlier into the process, we could find a point of agreement. You
Yeah,
know,
no, I totally agree. And I think,
sexual ethic.
yeah,
It's like we can all agree that like rape is evil. So let's do what we can to stop rape. I think that the way that our culture is set up so that men believe they're entitled to certain things, and women are treated like objects, and I'm like, this is happening all over. I mean, down to that mega church pastor that's saying, isn't my wife hot? you know
yeah,
and it's like, and we got like youth groups, where we've got like boys hitting on girls, and people are like just saying, well, boys will be boys, yeah. And it's just like, no, like what if we learn to treat human beings like human beings? And I think that's, it comes back to love, and recognizing the image of God in every person, whether male or female, whether gay or straight, whether like there's a whole bunch of labels we give people, and it's hindering our ability to love each other. And so again, the church will have a tendency to attack at a certain point in the issue, and I think we can back up and find the way to address an issue in a loving way and to speak to the heart, because we're all emotional beings. And when we talk about emotional beings, there's another analogy that I super love. And it's like the elephant and rider. And it's like this idea that our, instead of emotions, actually, we can say intuition. Our intuition is like an elephant, and our rationalization is like the rider on that elephant. And so what happens is the elephant turns a certain way, and our rationalization is like, oh, yeah, we're doing this because, and that's a tendency for all of us. And if we deny the fact that that's what's going on, we're lying to ourselves, because it's kind of like, I don't know, if you have a loved one that's like maybe making a clicking noise on a pen or something, and it's driving you crazy, and you're like, stop doing that. And it's like, why? It's like, I don't know. I'm going to come up with a reason now. And immediately you have to come up with a reason to rationalize why you were so angry, because you don't get angry for irrational reasons, right?
yeah,
And so I think we see that pattern. If we can recognize that pattern and understand, it's like, it's the intuition that needs to change. It's the intuition that needs to change on all of these issues. And so it's like, how do we change intuition? And I think there's a power in story. And that's why, the gospel message lived out in our lives, and us being able to be witnesses to the work of God in our lives is way more powerful than 1,000 arguments on science. And
yeah. Well, I think also too, part of the problem oftentimes is that we always want the immediate gratification. And so oftentimes that means that we're treating the symptom as opposed to the root problem. I mean, even look at medicine, right? Like if you, let's say you have a fever, right? You go to the drugstore and you get some medicine to lower the temperature. It's like, but what's causing the temperature? What do we try to figure that out?
Yes.
And then that will then have the effect of lowering the temperature. Lowering the temperature is not the goal. Just like, for example, when we're dealing with like COVID-19 and coronavirus, like everybody was always talking about flatten the curve. The end goal should never have been to flatten the curve. It should have been to destroy coronavirus. So then what we ended up doing, I think, with a lot of these shelter in place situations, was we artificially lowered the curve. Right. And then now that we open back up, now all of a sudden, hey, that curve's rising again. It's like, because we didn't actually get down to the root problem and actually defeat this thing. We treated the symptoms. We're like, flatten the curve, get over the hump. It's like, but you artificially did it. And I think that's oftentimes what we do in the church too. And within Christianity is, it's like, we want the immediate felt need to be taken care of right now. It's like, well, maybe the root issue is that you need to get your life right with Christ. Maybe the root issue is you need to repent of your mentality or your view on something, as opposed to just this one little minute little thing. And I think that's one thing that I think as Christians we can do a better job of get down to the root problem. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier when it comes to, food and diet and things like that. It's like, we always talk about the healthcare problem in North America, right?
Right.
It's like, well, maybe if people ate better
Mm-hmm.
and exercised and didn't just sit in front of their TV watching TV all day and eating junk food and processed foods full of crap chemicals, it's like maybe we'd be healthier. It's like, but no, we got to focus on the medication and the prescriptions and all this kind of stuff that are keeping people alive. It's like, well, eat healthier. Eat a lot of meat,
Yeah.
eat a lot of vegetables, eat real stuff, and then maybe you won't have all these health issues later on down the road. Thus, we don't need the huge healthcare system that we have. It's like, got to get down to the root problem.
I think part of the issue too is spiritual, and it's like you're looking at it, and it's like the way we view food. It's like, well, I had a rough day. I deserve that chocolate bar, and it's like, that's how we cope. Well, I had a rough day. I need to watch Netflix tonight. Like there's things in our lifestyle that are just coping mechanisms and not really dealing with, the heart issue, dealing with the emotional issue. There's a lot of things that we're not willing to face in our own lives. And I think that was kind of what I thought was interesting about sheltering in place too, is like, how do we adjust to this? Because essentially what happened is we all suffered a collective trauma. Now, I mean, like, I know that may sound like it's overstating it, but I think for some people it's definitely not overstating it. And there's a lot of people who had mental health issues as a result. And it's like figuring out like how to adapt to this new world situation. And everybody adjusted to it differently. And we're still adjusting to it differently. I mean, if you see how things are playing out on Twitter and on Facebook, it's like everybody's kind of adjusting differently. And I'm more of a roll with the punches kind of guy. And I'm like, okay, well, I got to figure out how to leverage this now, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm back to consulting with the consulting company. What can I learn about COVID? What are the things that I can do to, leverage this and figure out how we can get more work out of this? And obviously help other people through it, but it's like, it's part of our work too, right? And I think for you, it was like, well, I can step up my podcast game. We can work on this book. We can, and it's like figuring out, and it's like, it's not, I think, some people want to live in denial and some people want to just face it head on and be like, all right, how are we going to work with this? Because there's some things you just can't work against all the time. And there's people who went into this kicking and screaming and they're still frustrated because it's not changing. And so I think, like the different approaches to this, where it was like shelter in place. Okay, now we're going to let go of the restrictions. And then it's like, oh, well, our numbers are going up too fast. Okay, let's go back to shelter in place. And what we saw like in Alberta is that we had shelter in place. And then we started raising restrictions, lifting restrictions. And what happened is they said, we're going to monitor, what our ICU levels are. We're going to monitor how many cases we have. And if it increases this much over a week and all this stuff, then we'll start putting restrictions back in. And we've like continued to kind of like raise that level. And I think part of it too depends on population density. I think, like I've been to, a small town for work a few times and they've got no restrictions. Like everybody's just like, psh. You go to like Boston Pizza and there's like people wearing masks. That's the only place you see anybody in a mask is the waitresses and the serving staff at Boston Pizza. And I was thinking about this and I'm like, when we talk about like natural immunity, I'm like in a small town makes perfect sense. If you're like downtown Hong Kong, man, there's all kinds of stuff in the air. I'm like, I can see why they always wear masks, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's something there too. I also, without getting political, I think there's something unnatural about this virus too.
If you go to, again, it's not political. We'll call it science. If you go check out Brett Weinstein's podcast when he was on Joe Rogan.
Yes, I heard about that somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is something. And so this kind of argues against natural immunity. So I don't think I would go around Hong Kong just breathing in the air and letting people slobber on me. I just think it'd be a bad idea.
Yeah.
But yeah. And I mean, like that whole thing, like, I think that I know the Chinese government has, a history of mistreating their people. But to me, from a conspiracy standpoint, it would make so much more sense to figure out a way of releasing it systematically than to just like over the population and just be like, oh no, I lost my favorite doctor. Whoops, that was a bad weapon. So I think they were developing something and it got away on them. That's my theory.
More than likely. I know like that's even what Brett Weinstein was talking about, was like it was probably more than likely just like testing and seeing the development, and then when they make certain genetic changes, what happens, all that kind of stuff, and then it just got out and then just out of control. But also the interesting thing about it was he's like, because it was developed in a lab inside, he's like, one of the worst things we can do is stick everybody inside, because that's its natural environment, as opposed to going outside. It's like the sun will kill the thing, because it's not conducive to being outside under the sun. So that's an interesting take on that too.
Yeah, I don't think it lives very long outside either. But I do think that like if you're standing outside within 6 feet of another person breathing on them, it's still going to cause issues. So, but
I mean, it is a little creepy to breathe on people. So
yeah. Licking people's faces at Walmart, not to get political, but I'm a libertarian.
Again, not to get political, but Joe Biden.
I am not starting a Joe Bleep account on Twitter. I've got enough of those bleep accounts. Man, this has been good. I think we could probably wrap this up here.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And so if people want to know more about the great organization of Jeff Keepers, Gatekeepers Online, you guys have a website. Is it Gatekeepers Online?
Yeah, gatekeepersonline.com. And we've got podcasts, articles. We've got a couple of books out. We've got our last book, Social Injustice, that you can order right now. We also just put out an ebook called Why I'm Pro-Life. And so it's an interesting kind of take of diving into like the behind the scenes, like what frames your mindset. And then we're also pre-ordering 2 books. We've got one that's 5 Steps to Kill a Nation. And then the other one is Church and State, which actually was just started pre-orders today. And we got a bunch of really cool authors like Dr. Michael Brown, Pastor Greg Locke, Michael Massey, like a bunch of really good, solid, Christian leaders to contribute to it. So it's pretty cool.
Fun. All right. So stay tuned after the little air smudge thingy to hear a trailer of my upcoming release, Uncaged. Much love, everybody.
Air smudge.
On the placebo, little do we know, it's more than a training, it's a revolution, a true intrusion, of an inclusion, of an illusion, of a soul solution, of a soul solution.